a cloud workload breaks at 2 in the morning and customers are locked out, the last thing anyone needs is a debate about who owns the problem. Yet that is exactly how a lot of incident bridges start. Security, operations, and the business all looking at each other and at the cloud provider, trying to work out where ownership really sits. Those lost minutes matter, both for recovery and for trust. The idea behind the cloud shared responsibility model is to settle those questions long before an incident happens, so that when something does go wrong, everyone already knows which part is theirs.
This narration is part of the Tuesday Insights feature from Bare Metal Cyber Magazine, and it explores the cloud shared responsibility model in calm, practical terms. The goal is simple. By the end, you should be able to look at a cloud service and say with confidence which pieces your organization owns, which pieces the provider owns, and where the genuine gray areas live that need contracts, documentation, or runbooks to make them safe.
At its heart, the cloud shared responsibility model is a way of dividing ownership of security, reliability, and operations between the cloud provider and the customer. It is not a product or a checkbox, and it does not belong to any one vendor. It is a mental map and a working agreement. The provider takes on some responsibilities that used to be done on premises, such as running data centers and managing hardware. The customer keeps other responsibilities, such as configuring access, protecting data, and responding to incidents. The balance between those sides changes depending on how you use the cloud. You see that balance most clearly when you compare different service types. With infrastructure as a service, IaaS, the provider owns things like the physical data center, networking fabric, and hypervisor layer. You own the guest operating systems, host controls, application code, and much of the network configuration. With platform as a service, PaaS, the provider extends further up the stack to run the runtime and managed services, and you concentrate more on how you use those services, how you manage identity, and how you protect data. With software as a service, SaaS, the provider owns almost everything behind the login screen, and your responsibilities focus on users, data, and how the service is used day to day. It is just as important to be clear about what the cloud shared responsibility model is not. It is not a promise that the provider takes care of security, no matter how polished the slide looks. It is not a replacement for a service-level agreement, even if the same presentation mentions uptime and recovery times. It is also not something that automatically updates itself as you turn on new services and integrations. The model is a starting map. Your own policies, contracts, architectures, and runbooks are what turn that map into real behavior. In many teams, confusion comes from treating the cloud as one uniform thing. People assume that the provider owns roughly the same responsibilities across IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, when in reality, each service family has its own split. A security control that you manage yourself in an IaaS virtual machine might be fully baked into the platform in a PaaS or SaaS service. If that nuance is not understood and documented, you get overlapping effort in some places and dangerous gaps in others. The cloud shared responsibility model becomes real when you map it onto specific services in your environment. One practical way to start is to pick a single cloud workload, such as a customer-facing web application, and list out the layers that support it. You might think in terms of physical infrastructure, virtualization, operating system, middleware, application, identity, and data. At each layer, you note whether the provider owns it, you own it, or the ownership is genuinely shared. That exercise turns an abstract diagram from a marketing deck into something that is tied directly to the systems you care about. From there, you can look at how actions and events actually flow when something happens. Imagine that same web app running on virtual machines with a managed database. If the underlying hardware fails or a region goes offline, that sits squarely in the provider's column, and their monitoring, failover mechanisms, and support processes come into play. If the application breaks because a deployment went bad, a configuration was misapplied, or a transport layer security (TLS) certificate expired, that falls into your domain. In between are shared areas, such as protection against distributed denial of service (DDoS) attacks, or regional redundancy, where the provider offers features and you decide whether to enable them and how to use them. Configuration is where many of the practical details live. The provider usually exposes options for logging, identity integration, encryption at rest, encryption in transit, and security alerts. The cloud shared responsibility model reminds you that exposing those options is the provider's job, while deciding which ones to turn on, how to configure them, and how to monitor the resulting data is your job. When those choices are made thoughtfully, based on a clear sense of ownership, your environment behaves much more predictably when something breaks. Everyday use cases are where the model shows its value. During a cloud migration, teams use it to decide which controls move with a workload and which controls shift into the provider's side of the stack. For example, you might retire a homegrown logging agent in favor of a cloud-native logging service, but you still remain responsible for which events are collected, how long they are kept, and who reviews them. When you onboard a new SaaS collaboration tool, the model helps define who owns user lifecycle management, who owns data retention policy, and who monitors security alerts from the provider.
A quick win for many organizations is to apply the cloud shared responsibility model to one or two high-impact SaaS services, such as identity, email, or core collaboration. You assemble the right people, sketch the layers that matter for that service, and assign clear owners. That discussion often reveals simple gaps that can be closed quickly, such as admin accounts without clearly named owners, offboarding steps that are not written down anywhere, or alerts that arrive but are never reviewed. Closing those gaps does not require new tools. It simply requires turning implicit expectations into explicit responsibilities. On the more strategic side, some organizations standardize the model across their entire cloud portfolio. They create responsibility templates for major service families, such as virtual machines, managed databases, container platforms, and key SaaS categories. Those templates are then wired into architecture reviews, vendor risk assessments, and incident playbooks. Over time, the practice becomes muscle memory. A new service does not go live until there is a clear, documented split of responsibilities that links to real controls and real owners. The model also plays a quiet but important role in compliance and audit work. When an auditor asks who is responsible for a particular control, it is much easier to respond when you have a responsibility map that ties that control to either your organization or the provider, or explains how it is shared. You can show provider documentation for their portion and your own evidence, such as policies, configurations, and logs for your portion. That clarity reduces friction and shows leadership that cloud risk is being handled as a deliberate choice rather than an assumption. When the cloud shared responsibility model is well understood, it delivers several benefits. It reduces confusion during incidents because people no longer waste time debating whether an issue is ours or theirs. It supports better planning because architects can see which capabilities they are buying and which capabilities they still need to build or operate. It also improves conversations with leadership because you can describe cloud risk in terms of specific responsibilities, not in vague statements about the cloud being secure. There are trade-offs as well. Moving responsibilities to a provider does not always mean less work. A managed database service might remove the need to patch the underlying engine, but it can increase the importance of how you manage identity, network access, data classification, and backup strategy. A SaaS platform might simplify application management while making it more critical to get tenant configuration and admin access right. The cloud shared responsibility model surfaces those trade-offs so that you do not assume that managed automatically means simpler or safer on its own. The model has real limits, and ignoring them can lead to trouble. It does not remove the need for cloud and security skills inside your organization.
If teams do not understand the basics of how services are configured and how identity works in the cloud, they can misconfigure strong platforms in ways that create serious risk. The model also depends on process and culture. If leadership expects the provider to absorb almost all risk, efforts to invest in monitoring, logging, and training may be undercut, even though those activities sit firmly on the customer side of the responsibility line.
Complexity increases in multi-cloud and hybrid environments. Each provider has different default settings, security features, and documentation styles. If you try to rely only on vendor-specific diagrams, you can end up with multiple, incompatible mental models in different parts of the organization. To manage that, teams often create a common internal view of responsibility that sits above individual provider diagrams and translates those differences into a consistent language that people across the business can use.
Common failure modes show up most clearly in day-to-day behavior. One warning sign is when incident calls still begin with basic arguments about ownership. Another is when responsibility is documented only once at the moment of migration or purchase and then never updated as the service evolves. Over time, new features, integrations, and business processes appear, but the responsibility map stays frozen, leaving real gaps around identity, data sharing, or logging that no one has explicitly claimed.
Shallow adoption of the cloud shared responsibility model often looks like a beautiful diagram buried on an internet page that no one visits. People might remember seeing it during a kickoff workshop, but it does not show up in change reviews, incident runbooks, or audit responses. In that world, the model has not failed because it was wrong, but because it was never allowed to guide real decisions.
Healthy signals look very different. Responsibility maps are easy to find and are attached to key services. Architects refer to them when designing new solutions. Security teams use them when deciding where to place controls and how to tune monitoring. During incidents, people quickly check the parts of the stack they own, while also consulting provider status pages and support channels where appropriate. Ownership of cloud controls appears in role descriptions and onboarding material, not just in a slide deck for leadership.
When those healthy patterns are in place, the cloud shared responsibility model turns into something lived rather than something talked about. It becomes a shared language across security, operations, development, and the business. Instead of vague phrases about moving to the cloud securely, people talk about specific responsibilities, specific controls, and specific responses when things break. That is where the model earns its place as a practical tool rather than just a training topic.
At its heart, the cloud shared responsibility model is about making sure no critical part of your cloud environment falls into a gray area where everyone assumes someone else is in charge. It translates the broad idea of shared security into a concrete map of who owns infrastructure, services, identity, data, and everyday behavior. When that map is accurate, visible, and used, incidents move faster, risk decisions are clearer, and teams spend more time fixing real issues and less time arguing about boundaries. As you reflect on your own environment, it can be useful to choose one important cloud service and sketch out who truly owns what when it fails, when it is misused, or when it needs to evolve. That single exercise often reveals both quick tactical fixes and deeper conversations that need to happen with your provider and with your own teams. From there, you can gradually expand the practice, building a cloud estate where shared responsibility is not just a slogan, but a working way of managing risk together.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.